I was born to wear a crown, but the night I scrubbed floors in a duke's manor, I learned that dignity has nothing to do with thrones. And the man who would change everything stood before me in the candle-lit corridor, offering me £5,000 to become his lie. My name, the one whispered in the halls of a palace across the sea, was Ilara Valdrin, Princess of Lysandria. But in England, in the sprawling estate called Thornwood Manor, I answered only to Ilara Grey, a simple name for a simple girl, a maid with no past worth mentioning and no future worth dreaming about. That was the mask I wore, and I wore it so completely that some nights, when I caught my reflection in the darkened windows of the servants' quarters, I almost believed it myself. Lysandria was a small kingdom, nestled between mountain ranges that touched the clouds and rivers that sang ancient songs. The capital city, Valdoria, rose from the valley like a jewel, its spires and domes catching the sunlight in ways that made visitors weep with wonder. I had been raised in the palace at the heart of that city, a sprawling complex of marble and gold that had housed my family for 17 generations. My ancestors had built Lysandria from warring territories into a unified nation. My father had maintained the peace they had won, and I, their only child, had been groomed from birth to continue their legacy. I was taught to dance before I could run, my tiny feet guided across ballroom floors by patient instructors who treated me with reverence I did not yet understand. I was instructed in diplomacy before I understood what lies adults told, with smiles on their faces, learning to read the subtle shifts in expression that revealed more than words ever could. I studied languages and history, mathematics and philosophy, music and art. My days were filled with lessons, and my nights were filled with state dinners where I sat beside my parents and learned to smile at people who wanted things from us. Always things, always more. My mother, Queen Isabella, had hair the color of autumn leaves, a deep auburn that caught fire in the sunlight. Her laugh could fill a room, could make even the sternest advisors soften into something approaching humanity. She had been a princess of a neighboring kingdom before she married my father, and she had brought with her not just an alliance, but a warmth that transformed our court. She taught me that power was a responsibility, not a privilege, that a crown was a burden willingly carried for the sake of those who could not carry it themselves. My father, King Aldrich, was a gentleman whose greatest pleasure was reading poetry aloud to his family by the fire. He had none of the martial bearing of his ancestors, none of their appetite for conquest or glory. What he had was wisdom, a deep and quiet wisdom that saw to the heart of problems and found solutions that satisfied everyone. He taught me that strength was not the same as force, that the most powerful rulers were those who never needed to raise their voices because their subjects followed them out of love, not fear. We were happy. We were naive. We believed that our happiness was permanent, that the peace my father had maintained was unshakable, that the love of our people would protect us from all harm. We were wrong. The coup came not with armies, but with whispers. It began so quietly that we did not even recognize it for what it was. A rumor here, a newspaper article there, stories of financial mismanagement, of secret treaties that betrayed our allies, of royal extravagance while the common people suffered. None of it was true, but truth matters little when lies are repeated often enough. The architect of our downfall was my father's cousin, Lord Merrick Valdrin. He had always been ambitious, always hungry for the power that my father held, and he did not. As a child, I had found him merely tiresome, a distant relative who visited occasionally and looked at my father with barely concealed envy. As I grew older, I began to see the danger in him, the calculating intelligence that lurked behind his affable smile. But I never imagined he would go so far. He spent years laying the groundwork for his treachery. He cultivated allies in the parliament, men whose debts he paid and whose secrets he kept. He funded newspapers that printed his fabrications as fact. He whispered in the ears of influential citizens, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually blossom into outright rebellion. And when he finally made his move, when he stood before the parliament with forged documents and purchased testimonies, my parents had no choice but to abdicate or watch our kingdom descend into chaos. I remember the night they told me. We sat in my father's private study, the room where he had read me stories as a child, where he had taught me to play chess, where we had spent countless hours discussing the affairs of state. The fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and my mother's face was streaked with tears she was trying desperately to hide. "We must leave," my father said, his voice steady despite the devastation in his eyes. "Marek has given us until dawn. If we do not go willingly, he will have us arrested on charges of treason." Treason. The word was absurd. My father, who had devoted his entire life to Lysandria, accused of betraying it. But I knew, even then, that logic had nothing to do with any of this. Marek had won, and we had lost, and the only question that remained was how we would survive our defeat. They chose exile, a quiet estate in a distant land where they could live out their days in peace, watched but not harmed, prisoners in all but name. It was the best option available to them, the only option that did not end in imprisonment or worse. Marek did not want martyrs. Dead royals became symbols, rallying points for opposition. Living royals, quietly fading into obscurity, were much less dangerous. But I could not go with them. This was the part that still haunted me. 2 years later, the decision that I replayed in my mind during the long nights when sleep refused to come. Marek feared me more than he feared my aging parents. I was young, just 19, and I had always been popular with the common people. Where my father was respected, I was beloved. The merchants in the marketplace remembered the princess who had sneaked out of the palace to buy sweets from their stalls. The farmers remembered the princess who had insisted on visiting their villages, who had listened to their concerns with genuine interest, who had advocated for their needs in the palace councils. I was a threat to the legitimacy Marek so desperately craved, and he made it clear that if I remained near my parents, his spies would be watching, waiting for any excuse to act more decisively. So I made the choice that shattered my mother's heart and aged my father 10 years in a single night. I disappeared. Petra was my mother's lady's maid, a woman in her 50s who had served our family for 3 decades. She had gray hair and kind eyes, and hands that could soothe any hurt. When I told her my plan, when I explained that I intended to flee to England alone, to vanish so completely that even Marek's spies would never find me, she did not try to talk me out of it. She simply nodded, as though she had expected this all along, and began to make arrangements. She had a cousin, she told me, who had married an English merchant and moved to London decades ago. This cousin had connections in the household of a great estate, a manor called Thornwood in the countryside outside the city. The housekeeper there was known for asking no questions and valuing hard work above all else. It was not much, Petra admitted, but it was a start. The night I left the palace for the last time, I embraced my parents in the darkness of the servants' passage, the route by which I would make my escape. My mother pressed her wedding ring into my palm, a slim band of gold set with a single emerald, the ring my father had given her on the day they wed. "Keep this hidden," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and keep yourself safe. That is all I ask. Stay alive, my darling. Stay alive, and perhaps someday we will see each other again." My father held me close, his arms trembling with the effort of letting me go. "You are the best of us, Elara. Whatever happens, never forget that. You are the best of Lysandria, and nothing they do can take that away from you." I fled through the darkness with Petra at my side, slipping through passages known only to the palace servants, emerging at last into the cold night air of a city that no longer felt like home. Petra accompanied me to the border, where she had arranged for a trusted guide to take me the rest of the way. At the crossing, she pressed a letter of reference into my hands, a document so expertly forged that no one would question it. "I wanted to come with you," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But they will notice if I disappear. They will ask questions. It is better this way. Better that I stay and distract them, give them someone to watch while you vanish." I understood what she was saying. She was sacrificing her own chance at escape to ensure mine. She would remain in Lysandria under Merrick's suspicious eye while I fled to safety. It was a debt I could never repay, and we both knew it. "Thank you," I whispered, the words utterly inadequate for the magnitude of what she was giving me. "Thank you, Petra. I will never forget you." She smiled, a sad and gentle smile that I still see in my dreams. "Be happy, princess. That is all the thanks I need. Live your life and be happy." I crossed the border as the sun rose, and I did not look back. I could not bear to look back. If I had, I might have lost my courage entirely. The journey to England took 3 weeks. I traveled by coach and by cart, by ferry and by foot. I wore plain clothes and kept my head down and spoke as little as possible. Every stranger's glance made my heart race. Every question about my origin sent cold sweat trickling down my spine. But no one recognized me. No one suspected that the weary young woman with the worn valise and the haunted eyes was a princess in flight. I arrived at Thornwood Manor on a gray afternoon in early autumn. The estate was vast, larger than any I had seen outside of Lysandria, its grounds stretching across hills and valleys as far as the eye could see. The manor itself was a sprawling structure of gray stone and dark timber, its many wings and towers speaking of centuries of additions and expansions. It looked, I thought as I approached the servants' entrance, like a place where secrets went to hide. The housekeeper was a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see everything. She looked me up and down when I presented myself, her gaze lingering on my hands, which were soft despite my attempts to roughen them on the journey. "You have not done much hard work," she observed. "No, ma'am." I kept my voice humble, my eyes lowered. "But I am a quick learner, and I am not afraid of labor." She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "We shall see. You will start in the scullery. If you prove capable, we will find you more suitable work." And so Alara Valdrin, who had once worn silk and slept beneath canopies of velvet, became Alara Gray, who wore rough cotton and scrubbed pots until her hands cracked and bled. The first months were the hardest. I was not accustomed to physical labor, and my body rebelled against the demands I placed upon it. My back ached constantly. My knees bruised from hours spent on cold stone floors. My hands, once soft and smooth, became rough and reddened, the skin splitting at the knuckles when the weather turned cold. There were nights when I lay in my narrow bed in the attic, too exhausted even to cry, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But slowly, gradually, I adapted. I learned the rhythms of the household, the intricate dance of servants who kept a great estate running. I learned which tasks to volunteer for and which to avoid, which senior servants were kind and which were cruel, which corners of the manor were safe for a moment's rest and which were constantly watched. I learned to be invisible, to move through the house like a ghost, noticed only when something went wrong. The other servants were curious about me at first. They asked where I came from, who my family was, why I had sought work so far from home. I answered their questions with half-truths and misdirection, constructing a fictional past that was boring enough to discourage further inquiry. My father had been a clerk, I told them. My mother had been a lady's maid. They had died when I was young, and I had been raised by an aunt who had recently passed as well. There was nothing dramatic in my history, nothing worth investigating. I was simply a girl alone in the world, looking for honest work. They accepted the story, as I had hoped they would. The household was large, and new servants came and went with regularity. I was neither more nor less interesting than any of the others, and within a few months I had faded into the background of Thornwood Manor as completely as if I had been there my whole life. The master of the house, the Duke of Ashford, was a distant figure in those early months. I saw him occasionally, a tall shadow moving through the halls with purposeful strides, but he never acknowledged my existence, and I never sought to draw his attention. The servants spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices a mixture of respect and pity. They said he was cold, imperious, impossible to please. They said he had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman of great beauty and gentle spirit, but she had fallen ill with consumption and faded away before they could wed. They said he had not smiled since her death, that his heart had frozen over, that he had become more statue than man. I did not think much about him. I had my own griefs to carry, my own frozen places in my heart. I scrubbed his floors and polished his silver and did my best to survive each day without thinking too much about the life I had lost. 2 years passed in this way. 2 years of rising before dawn, of carrying coal scuttles and beating rugs until my arms ached. 2 years of keeping my head down, my voice soft, my past locked in a chamber of my heart that I dared not open. I had become skilled at invisibility, a master of the art of going unnoticed. Mrs. Pemberton appreciated my diligence and never asked about where I came from. The other servants thought me shy, perhaps a bit strange, certainly forgettable. And the Duke barely knew I existed. Until the night, everything changed. It was raining. Not the gentle English drizzle I had grown accustomed to, but a proper storm, the kind that rattled windows and made the old manor groan like a living thing. Lightning split the sky at irregular intervals, briefly illuminating the darkness before plunging everything back into shadow. Thunder rolled across the hills, a deep rumbling that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. I had been assigned to tend the fires in the east wing where the family's private chambers lay, because Bessie, the usual chambermaid for that section, had fallen ill with a fever. It was not a task I wanted. It brought me too close to the Duke's domain. But Mrs. Pemberton had fixed me with her stern gaze, and I had known better than to argue. I moved through the corridors with my coal bucket and matches, a ghost in a gray dress, doing my work and thinking only of the warm cup of tea that awaited me when I finished. The east wing was quiet at this hour, the family having retired for the evening, and my footsteps echoed off the polished floors with a loneliness that matched my mood. I did not expect to find the Duke standing in the hallway outside his study, staring at a portrait as though it held the answers to questions he could not bear to ask aloud. I stopped so abruptly that the coal in my bucket shifted, clattering against the metal sides with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. He turned, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Two strangers caught in the flickering light of the wall sconces. He was handsome, I realized with a start that surprised me. Handsome in the severe way of classical statues, all sharp angles and brooding shadows. His hair was dark, nearly black, and it fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it in frustration. His eyes, when they met mine, were the gray of storm clouds, deep and turbulent and filled with a pain he did not bother to hide. There was something in those eyes, something beneath the ice that made my breath catch in my throat. I curtsied quickly, prepared to apologize and flee, but his voice stopped me. You are the one who replaced Bessie tonight. Yes, Your Grace. I kept my eyes lowered, my voice barely above a whisper. I did not want him to look at me too closely. I did not want anyone to look at me too closely. What is your name? Elara Gray, Your Grace. He was silent for a long moment. I could feel his gaze on me, assessing, calculating. It was a sensation I remembered from my former life, the weight of scrutiny from people who were trying to determine what I was worth. But there was something different in his examination, something that felt less like evaluation and more like recognition. You do not move like a servant, he said at last. I looked up then, startled, and found him studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my expression blank, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, your posture, your hands, the way you stand." He gestured vaguely, as though the evidence was obvious. "You were not born to this life." A chill ran down my spine. In 2 years, no one had questioned my disguise. No one had looked at me closely enough to see through the mask I wore. But this man, this cold and distant duke, had taken one look at me and seen that something was wrong. I forced myself to summon a small, self-deprecating smile. "My mother was a lady's maid, Your Grace. She served in a great house before she married my father. She taught me to carry myself properly. It is a habit I cannot seem to break, no matter how inappropriate it may be." He considered this, his gray eyes never leaving my face. I could see him weighing my words, testing them for truth. Then, to my relief, he nodded. "Very well. Continue with your duties." I curtsied again and hurried past him, my coal bucket clutched like a shield. Only when I had turned the corner and pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, did I allow myself to breathe. He had noticed. After 2 years of perfecting my invisibility, the Duke of Ashford had looked at me and seen that I did not belong. I would have to be more careful. I would have to be invisible, not just in presence, but in every movement, every gesture, every breath. I did not sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his storm-gray gaze, searching, probing, seeing far more than I wanted him to see. In the weeks that followed, I did my best to avoid the East Wing entirely. I traded assignments with the other maids, volunteering for the dirtiest and most unpleasant tasks if it meant staying far from the Duke's chambers. I scrubbed the scullery floors on my hands and knees. I beat the rugs until my arms screamed with exhaustion. I did everything I could to keep myself buried in the anonymous mass of Thornwood's servants, far from the attention of its master. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The Dowager Duchess Constance arrived at Thornwood on a gray morning in early spring, her carriage drawn by 4 black horses, and her displeasure evident before she even stepped onto the gravel drive. She was the Duke's grandmother, a woman of 80 years, who moved with the imperious grace of someone who had spent her entire life being obeyed. Her hair was white as snow, swept up in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours to achieve. Her eyes were the same storm gray as her grandson's, but where his held ice, hers held fire. I was polishing the banister in the main hall when she arrived, and I had a clear view of the reunion between grandmother and grandson. She swept through the door without waiting for the footman to announce her, her cane tapping sharply against the marble floor. "Benedict." Her voice was crisp, commanding, the voice of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. "We need to talk." The Duke emerged from his study, his expression carefully neutral. "Grandmother, this is an unexpected pleasure. Do not play games with me, boy." She fixed him with a glare that would have made lesser men tremble. "You know exactly why I am here. 32 years old and still unmarried, still moping about like a lovesick poet, still refusing to do your duty to this family." "My duty." His voice was flat. "You mean my duty to provide you with great-grandchildren. I mean your duty to ensure that the Ashford line does not end with you." She advanced on him, her cane punctuating each word with a sharp tap. "I have been patient. I have given you time to grieve. But 5 years is long enough, Benedict. Marianne would not have wanted you to spend the rest of your life alone. Do not speak her name." The words were quiet, but they carried a weight of warning that made even the Dowager pause. She recovered quickly, her expression softening slightly. "I loved her too, you know. She would have been a fine duchess, but she is gone, and you are here, and the family needs an heir. What you need is not my concern. It should be." She met his gaze without flinching. "Because I have made a decision, Benedict. Marry before the end of the season, or I will cut you off from the family trust entirely." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen on the stairs, my polishing cloth forgotten in my hand, watching this battle of wills with the horrified fascination of a bystander at a carriage accident. "You cannot do that," the Duke said at last, his voice strained. "I can." The Dowager smiled, a cold and satisfied smile. "Your grandfather set up the trust specifically to give me this power. He knew even then that you might need motivation. Marry by the end of the season, Benedict, or lose everything." She turned and swept toward the stairs, forcing me to scramble out of her way. As she passed, her sharp eyes flicked over me briefly before moving on. I was invisible to her, a servant barely worth noticing. But even so, I felt the force of her personality like a physical blow. The Duke stood in the hall, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into his study, slamming the door behind him with a force that echoed through the entire house. The servants' hall buzzed with gossip for days. "She has given him an ultimatum," Bessie whispered as we polished silver in the scullery. "That is what Mrs. Pemberton says. The Dowager wants him married before the end of the season, or he loses everything." I said nothing, keeping my eyes on the fork in my hands, but I listened with more interest than I should have. "Can she do that?" Another maid, a young girl named Cora, asked with wide eyes. "Take away his inheritance?" "She controls the family trust," Bessie explained with the authority of someone who had eavesdropped on many conversations. "The old Duke set it up that way before he passed. Everything goes to the eldest male heir, but only if the Dowager approves. And the Dowager has decided she wants great-grandchildren before her time comes." Cora giggled. "The Duke will have to find a bride then." "Do you think he will choose someone from the season? One of those London ladies with their fancy gowns and their airs? Who else would he choose?" Bessie snorted. "He is a duke. He will marry a duke's daughter or an earl's daughter at the very least. Someone with breeding and connections, someone who can give him airs and throw dinner parties and look pretty on his arm." I thought of the portrait he had been staring at the night I encountered him in the corridor. I had looked at it the next morning, when the hallway was empty, and recognized the style of a miniature painter who had been popular in my own country. The woman in the portrait had soft brown hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone who would have made an excellent duchess had she lived. But she had not lived, and now the Duke was being forced to find another. I did not think about it again. It was not my concern. I was a maid, invisible and forgettable, and the marriage prospects of dukes existed in a world entirely separate from mine. Or so I thought. The summons came on a Thursday evening, delivered by Mrs. Pemberton herself, whose expression was pinched with confusion and something that might have been suspicion. "The Duke wishes to see you in his study," she said, her voice clipped. "Immediately." I set down the linens I had been folding, my hands steady even as my mind raced. "Have I done something wrong, Mrs. Pemberton?" I could not say. She looked me up and down, as though seeing me for the first time. There was something different in her gaze, a wariness that had not been there before. "But you had better go quickly. His Grace does not like to be kept waiting." I smoothed my apron, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, and made my way to the east wing. The corridor felt longer than it ever had before, the portraits on the walls seeming to watch me with knowing eyes. Generations of Ashford stared down at me as I passed, their painted faces stern and disapproving, as though they knew I did not belong. When I reached the study door, I hesitated for only a moment before raising my hand to knock. "Enter." His voice was deep, commanding, the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed without question. I opened the door and stepped inside, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he must hear it. The study was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild spring evening. Books lined every wall, reaching toward the ceiling like soldiers standing at attention, and a massive oak desk dominated the center of the room. The Duke stood by the window, his back to me, gazing out at the darkening gardens. He did not turn when I entered, closed the door. I did as he asked, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "You are Ilara Grey." He still did not turn. "The maid with the lady's maid mother." "Yes, Your Grace." "Tell me, Ilara Grey, do you know why I have summoned you here?" "No, Your Grace." At last he turned. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic composure, but his eyes burned with something desperate, something almost wild. He looked like a man who had been pushed to the edge of a cliff and was contemplating the fall. "I need a wife," he said flatly. "I need one by the end of the season, or I will lose everything. My grandmother has made that abundantly clear." I did not know how to respond to this, so I said nothing. "I have no desire to marry," he continued, pacing now, his long strides eating up the distance between the window and the fireplace. His movements were agitated, barely controlled, like a caged animal seeking escape. "I have no desire to court simpering debutantes, to attend balls and garden parties, to pretend that I am searching for love when love is the last thing I want or need." He stopped in front of me, so close that I could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, could see the fine lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. Up close, he looked older than his 32 years. He looked tired in a way that went far deeper than lack of sleep. "What I need," he said slowly, deliberately, "is a woman who will agree to a business arrangement. A woman who will pose as my wife for 1 year. Convince my grandmother that the marriage is real, and then quietly disappear. No questions, no complications, no emotional entanglements." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "Your Grace, I am not sure I understand. I am offering you £5,000. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as though he were discussing the purchase of a horse rather than the purchase of a human being's life. £5,000 to marry me in name only, to play the role of Duchess for 12 months. After that, you will leave, with the money and a reference that will open any door you choose. I will tell society that you have gone abroad for your health, and eventually I will announce that you have passed from a fever in some distant country. A quiet, convenient end to a quiet, convenient arrangement." My mouth opened, but no words came out. I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet, as though I had stepped into one of the fantastical novels the other maids liked to read by candlelight. Dukes did not propose marriage to scullery maids. Dukes did not offer fortunes to servants they barely knew. This was madness. And yet, why me? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you are a stranger here." His gray eyes bore into mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Because you have no family who will ask questions. Because you move like a lady, even if you scrub floors for a living." His jaw tightened. "And because I saw your face when I mentioned love, you flinched. You understood. You are as averse to it as I am. That makes you safe." I should have refused. I should have curtsied, begged his pardon, and returned to my linens and my invisibility. This was madness, dangerous madness, and I wanted no part of it. But even as I thought it, another voice whispered in my mind, "This could be your shield. A duchess, hidden in plain sight. No one would look for a runaway princess in the role of an English duke's wife. No one would think to question the background of a woman who had married so far above her supposed station. Lord Merrick's spies would never find Ilara Valdrin if Ilara Valdrin became the Duchess of Ashford. And there was the money. £5,000 was a fortune. With that sum, I could help my parents. I could find a way to send funds to them in their exile, ensure their comfort, perhaps even begin to build a network that might one day help restore them to their throne. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was the most terrifying proposition anyone had ever made to me. But I had survived a coup. I had survived exile. I had survived 2 years of scrubbing floors and biting my tongue and pretending to be someone I was not. I could survive this. I met the Duke's gray eyes, and I made my choice. I accept. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. He had expected me to refuse. He had prepared arguments, persuasions, perhaps even threats. But I had said yes, and now he was uncertain how to proceed. Very well. He recovered quickly, his mask of composure sliding back into place. We will begin immediately. My grandmother expects to meet my bride within the fortnight. You will need to be educated in the duties of a duchess, trained in the manners and customs of society. I will assign a tutor to you. That will not be necessary. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. He raised an eyebrow. I fumbled for an explanation, cursing myself for speaking without thinking. My mother taught me more than posture, Your Grace. She served in a great house, and she believed in preparing me for any eventuality. I know which fork to use at dinner. I know how to address a marquis versus an earl. I know the steps to every dance that will be performed at a society ball. It was not entirely a lie. My mother had taught me these things. She had simply taught them to me as a princess, not as a maid. The Duke studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes, the suspicions taking shape, but something held him back from voicing them. You are full of surprises, Alara Grey. I curtsied, hiding my face before he could see the truth in my eyes. I try to be useful, Your Grace. Benedict. His voice was softer now, almost gentle. If you are to be my wife, you should call me Benedict. I looked up, startled. The name felt strange on my tongue, too intimate, too real. Benedict. He nodded, satisfied. We will announce our engagement at my grandmother's dinner party next week. Until then, you will be moved from the servants' quarters to a guest room in the main house. We will say that you are a distant cousin, recently arrived from the continent, whom I met during my travels abroad. It is vague enough to be unverifiable and romantic enough to satisfy the gossips. And your grandmother? I asked. Will she believe this story? My grandmother believes what she wishes to believe, he said, a note of bitterness creeping into his voice. And right now, she wishes to believe that I am finally doing my duty. She will not look too closely at the details. I nodded, though my mind was spinning with the implications of what I had agreed to. I was about to become a duchess. I was about to enter a world of balls and banquets, of scrutiny and expectation. I was about to place myself in the very heart of English society, where one wrong word, one careless gesture, could expose everything. But I had no choice now. I had made my decision, and I would see it through. The first week of my transformation passed in a blur of activity and anxiety. I was moved from my narrow bed in the attic to a guest chamber that was twice the size of my parents' bedroom in exile. The walls were papered in soft blue silk, patterned with delicate flowers that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. The windows looked out over the rose garden, where the first blooms of spring were beginning to unfurl. A fire burned in the grate, filling the room with warmth, and a wardrobe full of dresses had been delivered overnight. They were not the latest fashions, Benedict explained when I asked. They had belonged to his mother, who had passed many years ago. But they were well made and would serve until the dressmakers could create a proper trousseau. I spent that first morning simply touching the fabrics, silk and velvet, wool and lace, textures I had not felt against my skin in 2 years. My fingers remembered them, even if my mind had tried to forget. This was what I had been born to wear, what I had been raised to expect. And yet now, standing in this borrowed room, in this borrowed house, wearing borrowed clothes to play a borrowed role, it all felt like someone else's dream. When I finally chose a dress, a simple day gown of deep green that brought out the color of my eyes, I stood before the mirror for a long time, staring at the woman who looked back at me. She was not Alara Grey, the scullery maid with chapped hands and a forgettable face. She was not Alara Valdrin, the princess with the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. She was something in between, a creature of shadows and secrets, wearing the costume of a duchess-to-be. I wondered if Benedict saw the same thing when he looked at me. The Dowager Duchess summoned me to tea that afternoon. I went with my chin high and my hands steady, prepared for battle. I had dealt with formidable women before. My own grandmother, the late Queen Mother of Lysandria, had been a force of nature who could reduce grown men to stammering schoolboys with a single glance. I was not about to be intimidated by an English dowager, no matter how fearsome her reputation. But the woman who greeted me in the drawing room was not quite the dragon I had expected. She was old, yes, and formidable, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that spoke of intelligence rather than cruelty. She was studying me, I realized, just as I was studying her. "So you are the mysterious cousin my grandson has been hiding," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Tell me about yourself, child. Where are you from? Who are your people?" I told her the story Benedict and I had rehearsed. A distant branch of the family, fallen on hard times after the death of my parents. An upbringing on the continent, moving from place to place as my fictional father sought work as a clerk. A chance encounter with Benedict during his travels 3 years ago. A correspondence that blossomed into something more. The dowager listened without interrupting, her gray eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, and I forced myself to sit still under her scrutiny, to betray nothing of the fear that churned in my stomach. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "I am sorry to disappoint you, Your Grace." I did not say I was disappointed. She set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "I said you were unexpected. There is a difference. My grandson has spent the last 5 years wallowing in grief and self-pity. I had begun to fear he would never emerge, and now, suddenly, he presents me with a bride. A bride with no connections, no fortune, no obvious advantages. Either he has lost his mind entirely, or there is something about you that I cannot see." I held her gaze, willing my expression to remain calm. "Perhaps, Your Grace, the advantage is simply that I ask nothing of him." Her eyes narrowed. "And what do you ask for yourself? Only to make him happy." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I delivered it smoothly. "Is that not what every wife should want?" The dowager studied me for another long moment. Then, to my surprise, she laughed. It was not a warm laugh, but it was genuine, and it transformed her face from something stern into something almost approachable. "You are cleverer than you look, child. Good. Benedict needs someone clever. He has been surrounded by sycophants and fools for far too long." She rose, signaling that the interview was over. "I will be watching you," she said, as I curtsied my farewell. "Remember that." I walked back to my new chamber with the dowager's warning ringing in my ears. She did not trust me. She knew on some instinctive level that I was not what I claimed to be. But she was willing to wait, to observe, to gather evidence before she struck. I would have to be very, very careful. The engagement dinner was a blur of candlelight and champagne, of curious faces and probing questions. The dowager had invited the cream of county society, eager to show off her grandson's unexpected choice of bride, and they descended upon Thornwood Manor like a flock of well-dressed vultures. I smiled until my cheeks ached, answered inquiries with half-truths and misdirection, and allowed Benedict to guide me through the evening with a proprietary hand at the small of my back. His touch was warm through the silk of my gown, and I found myself leaning into it despite my better judgment. We made a convincing couple, I thought. 2 people going through the motions of happiness, performing love for an audience that wanted desperately to believe. But there were moments, brief flashes, when the performance felt almost real. When Benedict leaned close to whisper a warning about an approaching gossip, his breath warm against my ear, and I caught the scent of him, sandalwood and something darker, something that made my pulse quicken. when his hand tightened on mine during a particularly intrusive question about our courtship, a silent message of solidarity that I felt all the way to my bones. When he looked at me across the dinner table, his gray eyes soft in the candlelight, and I forgot, for just an instant, that this was all pretend. I reminded myself harshly that it meant nothing. We were actors in a play, nothing more. He did not want a real wife, and I could not afford to be one. Our paths had crossed for a brief, strange moment, but they would diverge again. That was the agreement. That was the plan. And yet, the weeks that followed blurred into a strange rhythm of public performance and private distance. During the day, we played our roles flawlessly. We attended balls and garden parties, accepting congratulations with gracious smiles. We walked arm in arm through Hyde Park, allowing the ton to admire us. We sat side by side at the opera, close enough that anyone watching would assume we were a couple lost in the first flush of love. But at night, in the privacy of Thornwood Manor, we were strangers. Benedict retreated to his study after dinner, burying himself in ledgers and correspondence, emerging only when duty demanded his presence at some social function. I wandered the halls alone, relearning the rhythms of a great house from the perspective of its mistress rather than its servant. The servants who had once been my companions now curtsied when I passed and called me Your Grace. Mrs. Pemberton's expression was unreadable, but I sometimes caught her watching me with something that might have been resentment or might have been confusion. We spoke only when necessary, Benedict and I. We exchanged information about upcoming events, coordinated our stories, maintained the fiction, but there was no warmth in our interactions, no connection beyond the purely transactional. It was easier this way, I told myself, safer. The less I knew him, the easier it would be to leave when the year ended. But loneliness has a way of eroding even the strongest walls. It happened gradually, so gradually that I did not notice until it was too late. A question about my day tossed over his shoulder as he left for his study. A book left on my dressing table, a novel I had mentioned admiring in passing during a conversation with the dowager. A rare smile when I made a witty comment at a particularly tedious dinner party, a smile that reached his eyes for just an instant before the mask slid back into place. And then, one night, a conversation that changed everything. I could not sleep. The moon was full, casting silver light through my window, and my thoughts would not quiet. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and crept downstairs, intending to find a book in the library. The manor was silent, the servants long abed, and my footsteps echoed softly off the marble floors. But when I opened the library door, I found Benedict already there. He sat in an armchair by the dying fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring at the flames. He wore no coat or cravat, his shirt open at the collar, and he looked more human than I had ever seen him, more vulnerable. He looked up when I entered, and something in his expression made me hesitate. "I am sorry." I turned to go. I did not mean to intrude. "Stay." The word was soft, almost a plea. I hesitated, surprised by the raw need in his voice. Then I closed the door behind me and took the chair opposite his. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant ticking of a clock. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry lonely and mournful. "I was thinking about her," he said finally. His voice was rough, as though the words had been dragged from some deep place. "Marianne, my first. She would have been 30 this year." I said nothing, sensing that he needed to speak more than he needed a response. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. We grew up together. His gaze was distant, lost in memory. Our estates bordered each other. Our families had always intended for us to marry, had planned it before we were even born. But it was never an obligation for us. We loved each other, truly, deeply loved each other. From the time we were children, I knew she was the one I would spend my life with. I thought we would have forever. I am sorry. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. He looked at me then, his gray eyes piercing through the dim light. You are the first person who has said that, without pity in their voice. Everyone else. They look at me as though I am broken, as though my grief is a spectacle for their entertainment. Grief is not a spectacle. I kept my voice gentle, thinking of my own losses, my own hidden sorrows. It is a private thing, between you and the one you have lost. He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching my face. Then quietly, he asked, "Have you lost someone?" The question caught me off guard. I thought of my parents, alive but unreachable, exiled to a distant land I might never see again. I thought of Petra, who had sacrificed everything so that I could escape. I thought of Lysandria, the kingdom that had been my home, the life that had been stolen from me. Yes, the word was barely a whisper. I have lost a great deal. He did not ask for details. He simply nodded, a gesture of understanding that required no explanation. And in that moment, something shifted between us. We were no longer strangers playing roles. We were two broken people, sharing a silence that was more comforting than any words could have been. We sat together until the fire burned to embers and the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. We did not touch, did not speak beyond occasional fragments of thought. But when I finally rose to return to my chamber, when I bid him good night at the base of the stairs, he caught my hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and I went to my room and lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing that something fundamental had changed. I was no longer just playing a role. I was beginning to care. After that night, something shifted between us in ways both subtle and profound. The performances continued, as they had to. We attended balls and garden parties, accepted congratulations with gracious smiles, played the roles of devoted newlyweds for an audience that wanted desperately to believe. But they no longer felt like performances, at least not entirely. When Benedict took my hand, I felt the warmth of his skin rather than the calculation of the gesture. When he smiled at me across a crowded room, my heart stuttered in a way that had nothing to do with acting. When we danced together at the Pemberton Ball, when his arm wrapped around my waist and his eyes met mine, I forgot for a moment that any of this was pretend. I told myself it was dangerous. I told myself I was being foolish. But the heart does not listen to warnings, no matter how sensible they may be. We began to seek each other out in the quiet hours when no one was watching. Morning walks in the garden, where we discussed books and philosophy and the peculiarities of English society. Afternoon rides through the countryside, racing our horses along the riverbank and laughing when I nearly fell into the water. Evening conversations in the library, where he taught me about estate management and I shared what little I could of my fictional past on the continent. He never pressed me for details about my life before Thornwood. Perhaps he sensed that I was hiding something, but he respected my silence, just as I respected his. We existed in a bubble of the present, carefully avoiding both the past and the future. One afternoon, as we walked through the rose garden, he stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "Why did you agree?" he asked, "when I made my offer. You could have refused. You should have refused." It was an absurd proposition from a stranger. Why did you say yes? I had asked myself the same question many times in the weeks since that night in his study. The answer was complicated, tangled up with secrets I could not share, but I tried to give him what truth I could. "Because I understood," I said slowly, "what it feels like to be trapped, to have no good choices, only less terrible ones. You were desperate, and I recognized that desperation. I knew what it was to need an escape, even an imperfect one." He studied my face, his gray eyes searching. "And what were you escaping?" Ilara Gray? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Does it matter? It matters to me. The words hung in the air between us, laden with meaning. I felt my heart constrict, felt the walls I had built around myself tremble under the weight of his attention. Perhaps someday I will tell you, I said at last, but not today. He nodded slowly, accepting my deflection with a grace I did not deserve. Someday, then. We continued our walk in silence, but the silence was different now. It was full of unspoken things, of promises half made and questions half answered. And when his hand brushed against mine, when his fingers intertwined with mine as though it were the most natural thing in the world, I did not pull away. The wedding took place 3 months after our engagement, in the chapel at Thornwood Manor. It was a small ceremony, attended only by family and the closest friends of the Ashford name. The dowager presided with surprising warmth, her gray eyes suspiciously bright as she watched her grandson take his vows. I wore a gown of ivory silk, trimmed with lace that had been worn by Benedict's mother and grandmother before her. My mother's ring hung on a chain around my neck, hidden beneath the fabric, a piece of my old life carried into my new one. When Benedict slipped his ring onto my finger, when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, I felt something settle into place within my soul. This was real, I thought. Whatever games we were playing, whatever lies we had told, this moment was real. I was married. I was a duchess. I was bound to this man by law and by God, for better or for worse. For better or for worse. The months that followed were the happiest I had known since leaving Lysandria. We settled into a rhythm of companionship that felt less like performance and more like partnership. Benedict emerged from his grief slowly, like a flower opening to the sun. He laughed more often. He spent less time buried in his study. He began to engage with the estate and its tenants in ways he had not done for years. I watched him change, and the watching filled me with a tenderness I could not name. He would return from a morning ride with color in his cheeks, eager to tell me about a new foal born in the stables or a tenant's child who had recovered from illness. He would sit across from me at breakfast and actually eat, rather than staring at his plate with the hollow eyes of a man going through motions. He began to smile, without prompting, without occasion, simply because something had pleased him. The dowager noticed the change as well. She said nothing directly, but I caught her watching us sometimes, her sharp gray eyes softened by something that might have been satisfaction. She had gotten what she wanted, a married grandson with the promise of heirs. But I sensed that she had gotten more than she bargained for. She had wanted compliance. She had gotten happiness. One afternoon, as I walked through the portrait gallery, she appeared beside me as though conjured from the shadows. "You have done something remarkable," she said without preamble. "Your Grace?" She gestured toward the window, where Benedict could be seen in the garden below, playing with one of the estate dogs. He was laughing, actually laughing, as the animal bounded around him in circles. "I have not seen him like this since Marianne fell ill," the dowager said quietly. "I thought that part of him had gone forever. But you have brought it back." I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. "I do not know what your secrets are," she continued, fixing me with her penetrating gaze. "And I have decided I do not care to know. Whatever you are hiding, whatever brought you to this house, it has given my grandson back to me. For that, I am grateful." She turned and walked away before I could respond, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the marble floor. And I stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by generations of Ashfords, and wondered how much longer I could keep my secrets hidden. And I found myself falling in love with him. It happened slowly, so slowly that I did not recognize it at first. But there were moments when the realization struck me like a physical blow. The way my heart leaped when I heard his footsteps in the corridor. The way my breath caught when he smiled at me across the dinner table. The way my body leaned toward him without conscious thought when we sat together in the library. I loved his rare smiles and his hidden gentleness. I loved the way he listened to me as though my words mattered. I loved the man behind the mask of ice, the man who was slowly, carefully, learning to feel again. And I had been lying to him from the very beginning. The guilt gnawed at me constantly. Every time he trusted me with another piece of his heart, every time he confided in me about his fears and his hopes and his dreams, I felt the weight of my deception pressing down on me. I was not who he thought I was. I was not the simple girl from a humble background who had captured his attention by chance. I was a princess in hiding, a fugitive from a kingdom across the sea. And if he ever learned the truth, everything we had built together would crumble to dust. I told myself that I would tell him eventually, when the year was over, when the danger had passed, when I could be certain that revealing my identity would not put him at risk. But deep down, I knew I was simply afraid of his reaction, afraid of his judgment, afraid of losing the only happiness I had found since my world fell apart. And so I kept my secrets, and I loved him in silence, and I tried not to think about the future that was rushing toward us like a storm. The letter arrived on a gray morning in late May. I was in my sitting room, embroidering a handkerchief with the Ashford crest, when Mrs. Pemberton brought it to me. The envelope was heavy, the paper expensive, and the seal was one I recognized with a jolt of pure terror, the royal crest of Lysandria. I waited until Mrs. Pemberton left before breaking the seal with trembling fingers. The letter inside was short, written in a hand I did not recognize. "Your Royal Highness," it began, and the words blurred before my eyes. "The situation in Lysandria has changed. Lord Merrick's grip on power is weakening. The alliances he built have crumbled, the lies he told have been exposed, and the people remember the kindness of your father, the grace of your mother. They speak your name in the marketplaces and the taverns. They light candles for you in the churches. They have not forgotten their princess. There are those among us who believe the time has come to restore the rightful monarchy. We have located your parents and ensured their safety. They are well, though they grieve for you. Now we seek you. A delegation will arrive in London within the fortnight. They carry proof of their legitimacy, documents that only you will recognize. We ask only for an audience, a chance to explain what we propose. Your people have not forgotten you, Princess. We pray that you have not forgotten us." The letter was unsigned. I sat for a long time, the paper clutched in my hands, staring at nothing. For 2 years, I had dreamed of this moment. For 2 years, I had imagined what it would feel like to learn that there was hope, that the nightmare might end, that I might one day go home. But now that the moment had arrived, all I could think about was Benedict. If I returned to Lysandria, if I reclaimed my throne, I would have to leave him. Our marriage was not real, I reminded myself. It was a contract, a business arrangement, a lie that would end in 12 months regardless. He did not love me. He had hired me to play a role, nothing more. But even as I thought it, I knew it was no longer true. He loved me. I had seen it in his eyes, felt it in his touch, heard it in the words he whispered when he thought I was asleep. He loved me, and I loved him, and the lie that had brought us together was now the wall that stood between us. If I told him the truth, I would lose him. How could he trust a woman who had deceived him so completely? How could he forgive a wife who had hidden her entire identity from him? But if I did not tell him, if I simply disappeared when the year ended, as we had planned, I would carry the weight of that betrayal for the rest of my life. I hid the letter in the false bottom of my jewelry box, where I kept my mother's ring, and told myself I would decide what to do later. But later became a week, and a week became 2, and still I could not bring myself to speak. The delegation arrived in London on a Tuesday. I learned of their presence through the society papers, which reported breathlessly that a group of foreign diplomats had arrived from a small European kingdom called Lysandria, seeking to establish closer ties with Britain. The papers speculated about trade agreements and political alliances, never guessing that the true purpose of the visit was to find a lost princess hiding in plain sight. I knew I could not avoid them forever. Sooner or later, they would hear about the new Duchess of Ashford, the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere and captured the heart of one of England's most eligible bachelors. They would investigate. They would recognize me. And then everything would fall apart. The confrontation came at a ball. It was the grandest event of the season, hosted by the Marquis of Pembroke, and everyone who was anyone in London society would be in attendance. The ballroom was a masterpiece of gilt and crystal, with chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars and walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the candlelight into infinity. An orchestra played in the gallery above, filling the vast space with melodies that seemed to float on the perfumed air. I dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that matched my mood. It was embroidered with silver thread that caught the light when I moved, and the bodice was cut in the latest fashion, revealing just enough of my shoulders to be elegant without being improper. Benedict helped me fasten my necklace, his fingers warm against my skin, and I felt a pang of something like grief when I looked at him. He did not know this might be our last evening together. He did not know that by the time the night was over, everything might be different. "You are beautiful tonight," he said softly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. I forced a smile. "You are biased, perhaps." He pressed a kiss to my shoulder, but that does not make it less true. We arrived at the ball arm in arm, and I smiled until my face ached and danced until my feet throbbed and pretended that my world was not about to collapse. The faces around me blurred into a sea of silk and satin, of powdered wigs and glittering jewels. Everyone wanted to meet the new Duchess, to assess her, to judge whether she was worthy of the man she had captured. I answered their questions and accepted their compliments, and wondered how many of them would turn on me when the truth came out. I saw them across the ballroom, a cluster of men in unfamiliar uniforms, speaking with the Marquess. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a face weathered by time, looked up and caught my eye. And I knew. I knew that he knew. He began to make his way toward me, moving through the crowd with a determination that made my heart race. I looked around desperately for Benedict, but he was on the other side of the room, deep in conversation with a group of gentlemen. "Your Royal Highness." The voice was soft, pitched for my ears alone. I turned to find the silver-haired man standing before me, his eyes bright with emotion. "I do not know what you mean." I kept my voice steady, though my hands trembled. "You must have mistaken me for someone else. I was your father's chief advisor for 30 years. His voice cracked. "I held you in my arms when you were an infant. I taught you to ride your first pony. I watched you grow into the woman you are today. Please, Princess, do not pretend you do not know me." I closed my eyes, defeat washing over me. "Count Aldrich." He grasped my hands, his grip fervent. "We have found you. After all this time we have found you. Your people need you, Highness. Lysandria needs its princess. I cannot." The words were torn from me. "I cannot simply leave. There are complications." "Complications?" He frowned. "What complications could possibly matter more than your kingdom?" "She means me." The voice came from behind me, deep and cold. I turned to find Benedict standing there, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He must have seen me speaking with the stranger, must have crossed the ballroom to investigate. "Benedict." I reached for him, but he stepped back, evading my touch. "Please, let me explain." "Explain?" His voice was ice. "Explain that you have been lying to me from the moment we met? Explain that the woman I hired to be my fake wife is actually a princess?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Tell me, Your Royal Highness, was I part of your game all along? A convenient cover while you waited for your people to come rescue you? No." Tears burned in my eyes. It was never a game. I was hiding, Benedict. I was afraid for my life, for my parents' lives. I never meant to deceive you. I never meant to. To what? He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. To make me care for you? To make me believe that you might actually? He stopped, his jaw clenching. The words he could not say hung in the air between us, heavy with pain. Your Grace. Count Aldrich stepped forward, his tone conciliatory. I understand that this is a shock, but Princess Alara's safety has been our paramount concern. She did what she had to do to survive. Surely you can understand that. Benedict did not answer. He simply looked at me, his gray eyes filled with something that might have been betrayal, might have been grief, might have been the death of whatever fragile hope had begun to grow between us. Then he turned and walked away. I wanted to run after him. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg him to listen, to understand, to forgive. But Count Aldrich's hand was on my arm, and the ballroom was full of watching eyes. And I was a princess, and princesses did not make scenes. I let him lead me away. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and negotiations. Count Aldrich and his delegation laid out their plans in meticulous detail. Lord Marrick's support had crumbled. The Parliament had turned against him. The people were demanding the return of the true royal family. All that was needed was for me to return and claim my birthright. I listened, and I nodded, and I said all the right things. But my heart was not in Lysandria. My heart was at Thornwood Manor, with a man who would not see me, would not speak to me, would not even acknowledge my letters. He hates me. I stood at the window of my London townhouse, watching the rain streak down the glass. He will never forgive me. Forgiveness takes time, Count Aldrich said gently. But first, you must decide. Will you return to Lysandria? Will you take your place on the throne? The question hung in the air, waiting for an answer. I thought of my parents, still in exile, still waiting for news. I thought of my people, the farmers and merchants and craftsmen who had cheered for me as a child, who had wept when I disappeared. I thought of the duty that had been pressed upon me from birth, the crown that was my destiny and my burden. And I thought of Benedict, his rare smiles, his hidden gentleness, the way he had held my hand in the darkened library and shared his grief with me, trusting me with the most broken parts of himself. I cannot abandon him. The words surprised me even as I spoke them. Not like this, not without at least trying to make him understand. Count Aldrich sighed. Your Highness, the delegation cannot wait indefinitely. Decisions must be made, alliances formed. The situation in Lysandria is fragile, and every day we delay is a day our enemies might use to rebuild their strength. Then give me 1 week. I turned from the window, my chin high. 1 week to resolve my affairs in England. After that, I will give you my answer. He hesitated, clearly unhappy with the delay, but something in my expression must have convinced him, because he nodded. 1 week. I left for Thornwood Manor that very afternoon. The journey took 3 hours, and every minute felt like an eternity. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray, heavy with clouds that mirrored my mood. I stared out the carriage window at the passing countryside, seeing nothing, thinking only of what I would say when I arrived, if he would even see me. The manor looked different than I remembered, smaller somehow, and sadder. The gardens were beginning to wilt, as though even the flowers could sense that something had gone wrong. I climbed out of the carriage and stood on the gravel drive, my heart pounding, wondering if I would even be admitted. The door opened before I could knock. Mrs. Pemberton stood there, her face a study in conflicting emotions. Your Grace. The title felt strange now, weighted with irony. He said you would come. He knew? I asked. He has been waiting for you in the library. I walked through the familiar halls, past the portraits and the candlesticks, and the grandfather clock that had marked the hours of my strange double life. The house felt empty. silent, as though it were holding its breath. When I reached the library door, I paused to gather my courage before pushing it open. Benedict stood by the window, his back to me, just as he had been the first night we truly spoke. He did not turn when I entered. You came. I could not stay away. I took a step toward him, then another. Benedict, I am sorry. I am so sorry for the lies. I never meant to hurt you. He turned then, and I saw that his face was pale, his eyes shadowed. He looked as though he had not slept in days. He looked as broken as I felt. I have spent the last week trying to hate you, he said quietly. Trying to convince myself that everything between us was a lie. That you were using me, manipulating me, laughing at me behind my back. I have never laughed at you. My voice broke. Everything I felt, everything I feel is real. The lies were about my past, not about my heart. He was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he asked, "What is your real name?" "Ilara." I met his eyes, willing him to see the truth in them. My name is Ilara. That, at least, was always true. And the rest of it? The princess? The kingdom? The coup? All true. I spread my hands helplessly. I am the heir to the throne of Lysandria. My family was deposed, my parents exiled. I came to England to hide, to disappear. I never expected to find you. I never expected to fall in love. The word hung in the air, dangerous and fragile. Love. He said it as though testing the weight of it. You love me, yes. The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, like surrendering to gravity. I love you, Benedict. I love the man who showed me his grief in this very room. I love the man who left books on my dressing table and taught me about estate management and raced me along the riverbank. I love you, and I am terrified that I have lost you forever. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides. His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing away tears I had not realized I was shedding. I have spent the last week, he said, his voice rough, trying to hate you. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time I tried to sleep, I remembered the sound of your laughter. And I realized that I cannot hate you, Ilara. I cannot hate you, because somewhere along the way, against all reason and intention, I fell in love with you too. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks we had exchanged for show. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the words we had never said. I melted into him, my arms wrapping around his neck, my heart singing with a joy I had never expected to feel. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. What happens now? He asked. Your people want you back. They want you to be their queen. I know. And do you want that? Do you want to return to Lysandria? I pulled back so I could look into his eyes. I want to be with you. That is what I want more than anything in the world. But I also have a duty to my people, a duty I cannot simply abandon because I have found happiness. He nodded slowly. Then we will find a way to honor both, your duty and our love. There must be a path forward that does not require you to sacrifice one for the other. And if there is not? He cupped my face again, his gaze fierce. Then we will create one. I laughed, a shaky, disbelieving sound. You would do that? Give up your life here, your estate, your position, to help me reclaim a throne you have never seen? I would follow you to the ends of the earth, Ilara Valdrin. He smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I have spent 5 years hiding from love because I was afraid of losing it again. But you have shown me that love is worth the risk. Whatever comes next, we will face it together. I kissed him again, pouring all my hope and fear and gratitude into the embrace. When we separated, I took a deep breath. Then let us go, I said, together. The true wedding, the one that mattered, took place in the chapel of Thornwood Manor on a golden afternoon in June. The first ceremony had been legal, but hollow, 2 strangers binding themselves together for convenience. This one was different. This one was real. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. She had been shocked by the revelation of my true identity, but she had recovered quickly, and I suspected that part of her was pleased. Her grandson was not merely marrying a nobody from the continent. He was marrying a princess. The Ashford name would be linked to royalty, however small the kingdom might be. Count Aldrich served as witness, his weathered face alight with joy. He had feared I would choose love over duty, choose England over Lysandria. But I had found a way to choose both. When Benedict slipped a new ring onto my finger, when he spoke his vows with a conviction that made my heart ache, when he kissed me as the sunlight streamed through the chapel windows, I felt a peace I had not known for years. I was going home, and I was not going alone. We departed for Lysandria a week later. The journey was long and arduous, across the Channel and through the heart of Europe. But Benedict was beside me every step of the way, his hand clasped in mine, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. We talked through the nights, planning our approach, discussing the challenges that lay ahead. He learned the history of my kingdom, studied its politics and its people, prepared himself for the role he would play as my consort. When we finally crossed the border into Lysandria, when I saw the mountain peaks and heard the rushing rivers that had haunted my dreams for 2 years, I wept. Not from sorrow, but from a joy so profound it could not be contained. We were met at the capital by a crowd so vast it seemed to fill the entire city. They cheered and wept and threw flowers at our carriage. They chanted my name, my real name, the name I had not heard spoken aloud since the night I fled. Princess Alara has returned. My parents were waiting for me at the palace steps. My mother, thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked with more gray. My father, leaning on a cane now, his eyes bright with tears. They embraced me, held me, whispered words of love and relief that I would carry in my heart forever. And when I introduced them to Benedict, when I explained that he was not just my husband, but my partner in all things, they welcomed him with open arms. The restoration was not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. There were political battles to fight, alliances to forge, wounds to heal. Lord Merrick and his supporters were tried and exiled, not harmed, for I would not begin my reign with cruelty. The people, so long starved for hope, rallied behind me with a fervor that humbled me every day. The first year was the hardest. There were factions who did not trust me, who whispered that I had abandoned my kingdom when it needed me most. There were those who had prospered under Marek's rule and resented the return of the old order. There were foreign powers who had made advantageous deals with the usurper and now found those deals nullified by a queen who remembered their complicity. But I had learned patience in my years of exile. I had learned that true strength lies not in force, but in persistence. I listened to my critics and addressed their concerns. I reached out to former adversaries and offered them paths to reconciliation. I worked tirelessly from dawn until well past midnight, rebuilding the bonds of trust that Marek had shattered. Benedict was invaluable in those early days. He brought a fresh perspective, uncolored by the old grievances and rivalries that had plagued Lysandrian politics for generations. He asked questions that no one else thought to ask, challenged assumptions that everyone else took for granted. And he loved me through it all. Loved me when I was exhausted and discouraged. Loved me when I doubted myself. Loved me when the burden of the crown seemed too heavy to bear. And through it all, Benedict was beside me. He learned the language of my people, threw himself into the work of governance, became a partner in every sense of the word. The court was suspicious of him at first, this foreign duke who had married their princess, but his kindness and his dedication won them over. Within a year, he was as beloved as I was. We were happy, truly, deeply happy. And on a spring morning, exactly 2 years after I had first knelt to scrub the floors of Thornwood Manor, I stood on the balcony of the royal palace with Benedict's arm around me, watching the sun rise over the mountains of my homeland. "We have come a long way," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my temple. From a business arrangement in a candlelit study to here. I smiled, leaning into his warmth. I would do it all again, every moment of fear, every lie, every heartbreak, because it led me to you. He turned me to face him, his gray eyes soft in the morning light. "And I to you, my queen, my queen." The title still felt strange, still filled me with wonder. I had been a princess in exile, a maid in hiding, a duchess by deception. But now, at last, I was simply Ilara, a woman loved and loving. A queen not just of a kingdom, but of my own heart. I kissed my husband as the sun rose higher, gilding the world in gold. The past was behind us, full of shadows and secrets. But the future lay ahead, bright and full of promise. And I stepped into it, hand in hand with the man I loved, ready for whatever came next. Some stories end with a coronation, a grand ceremony of velvet and gold. Mine was no different in that regard. The crown was heavy on my brow, the scepter cold in my hand, the robe stiff with centuries of tradition. But when I looked out over the sea of faces in the great cathedral, when I saw my parents in the front row weeping with joy, when I felt Benedict's hand squeeze mine in silent support, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Lysandria flourished. We reopened the trade routes that Lord Marek had closed, rebuilt the schools and hospitals that had fallen into disrepair, restored the bonds of trust between the crown and the common people. I worked tirelessly, and Benedict worked beside me, and together we built something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. My parents lived to see their kingdom restored, their daughter crowned, their legacy secured. My mother passed peacefully in her sleep on a winter night, surrounded by family, with a smile on her lips. My father followed her 3 months later, as though he could not bear to be without her for long. I mourned them deeply, but I mourned them with gratitude too, for the years we had been given, for the love we had shared, for the chance to say goodbye. And then, on a spring morning that smelled of jasmine and rain, I held my firstborn child in my arms. She had Benedict's gray eyes and my dark hair, and she cried with a spirit that made the midwife smile. "A strong one," the woman said approvingly. "She will be a fine queen someday." I looked at my daughter, this tiny, perfect creature who carried the blood of 2 nations in her veins, and I felt a love so overwhelming it took my breath away. "What shall we call her?" Benedict asked, his voice hushed with awe. I thought of my mother, whose grace had guided me through the darkest nights. I thought of Petra, whose sacrifice had made my survival possible. I thought of all the women who had shaped me, held me, saved me. "Isabetta," I said softly, "for my mother, and Petra, for the woman who gave me my freedom." Benedict kissed my forehead, then reached down to touch our daughter's tiny hand. Isabetta Petra, a name worthy of a princess, and so our family began. There were more children after Isabetta, a son named Aldrich, after my father and the count who had brought me home. A second daughter named Marianne, for the woman Benedict had loved and lost, whose memory we honored rather than buried. They filled the palace with laughter and chaos, with muddy footprints and broken vases and arguments over who got to ride the best pony. Benedict and I grew old together, our hair turning silver, our steps slowing, our love deepening with every passing year. We walked the gardens of the palace hand in hand, just as we had once walked the gardens of Thornwood. We sat by the fire in the evenings, reading aloud to each other, debating philosophy and politics, remembering the strange, improbable path that had brought us together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked me once, on a quiet night when the children were grown and the palace was still. "Leaving England? Giving up the life you might have had there?" I looked at him, this man who had hired a maid to be his fake wife and ended up with a queen. I thought of the grand estates I had left behind, the society that had scrutinized and judged me, the life of comfortable anonymity I might have lived. Never, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. I would not trade a single moment of this life for anything. He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that still made my heart skip after all these years. Nor would I. I write this now, on a winter evening in my 70th year, as the snow falls softly outside my window and the fire crackles in the grate. My husband sleeps in the chair beside me, his face peaceful, his hand still reaching for mine even in slumber. My children are grown, my grandchildren are thriving, and my kingdom is at peace. I was born to wear a crown, and I have worn it with honor. But the greatest treasure of my life was never the throne or the palace or the jewels. It was love. The love of my parents, who gave me roots. The love of my people, who gave me purpose. The love of my husband, who gave me himself without reservation or condition. And when I think of that night so long ago, when a desperate duke offered £5,000 to a frightened maid, I cannot help but smile. He did not know she was a princess. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, because in his ignorance, he saw me truly, not as a crown or a title or a political advantage, just as a woman he could learn to love, and I, who had lost everything, found in his love a kingdom greater than any I had ever known. This is my story, the story of a princess who scrubbed floors, a duke who feared his own heart, and the love that saved them both. It is not a fairy tale, for fairy tales are simple and life is anything but. But it is true, every word of it, and that is worth more than any fiction could ever be. The snow continues to fall. The fire burns low, my husband stirs, reaching for me, and I take his hand as I have taken it 1,000 times before. We are old now, and our story is nearly finished. But as I look back over the years, over the triumphs and the sorrows, the laughter and the tears, I find that I have no regrets. I was a princess in exile. I became a maid, a duchess, a queen. But always, always, I was loved. And in the end, that is the only thing that truly matters.